Baron Trump sat quietly in the luxurious first-class cabin, gazing out the airplane window as the evening sun cast its golden glow over the tarmac. The hum of the boarding passengers filled the air, but Baron barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive voice broke the calm. "Excuse me, but what is he doing here?" barked the pilot, his sharp tone cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. He was glaring directly at Baron. The passengers froze, their eyes darting between the pilot and the young man. If you're wondering how this all unfolded and what happens next, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the shocking turn of events that changed everything. Baron looked up, confused but calm. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his voice steady, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. The pilot sneered. "Yes, there is a problem. People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity ride." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Baron's heart sank, but not for himself. He'd faced criticism and scrutiny all his life. This wasn't new. What struck him was the hatred in the pilot's eyes. It wasn't about his seat. It was something deeper, uglier. Passengers began whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. An older woman sitting nearby leaned toward Baron and whispered, "Are you okay, young man?" Baron nodded, offering a polite smile. But the pilot wasn't done. He stepped closer, pointing a finger at Baron like a judge delivering a sentence. "I don't care who you are. You're not staying in this cabin. Either you move, or I'll have you removed from this flight." At that moment, Baron's calm demeanor shifted. He stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention. The murmurs stopped. All eyes were on him. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but measured, "I have a ticket for this seat. I belong here as much as anyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." The pilot smirked, crossing his arms. "We'll see about that." He stormed off toward the cockpit, leaving a trail of tension behind him. The passengers were visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared to intervene. Baron sat back down, his hands resting on the armrests. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. Something about this man's hostility didn't sit right, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, a storm was brewing. Not just in the air but in the hearts of those witnessing this confrontation. And what was about to happen next would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew. Minutes passed, but the tension lingered in the cabin like a storm cloud. The pilot hadn't returned yet, but his words hung heavy in the air. Baron noticed the anxious glances passengers were throwing his way. Some seemed sympathetic, while others looked hesitant, unsure of how to react. The flight attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, approached Baron cautiously. "Sir," she whispered, leaning down slightly, "is everything all right? I overheard what the captain said. If you'd prefer, I can see about moving you to another seat." Baron looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you," he replied softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to be here." The attendant nodded, a hint of admiration flashing across her face, but her concern remained. "Just let me know if you need anything," she added before hurrying back down the aisle. Then, the unexpected happened. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing a delay. There's a security concern we need to address." Baron froze. Security concern? The pilot's earlier hostility suddenly made sense. He wasn't just being rude, he was trying to paint Baron as a threat. A calculated move meant to justify his actions. Passengers began murmuring again, their whispers growing louder as speculation spread. A man across the aisle leaned forward. "Is he talking about you?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and unease. Baron didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened the camera app. If things escalated, he wanted to make sure there was a record. Just then, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The murmurs turned into an audible buzz. Barron watched as the officers made their way down the aisle, their eyes scanning the passengers. They stopped in front of him. "Sir," one of them said, his voice professional but firm, "we need you to come with us." Barron's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He stood up calmly, his towering frame making the officers hesitate for just a moment. "Can I ask why?" he inquired. "We've been informed of a potential issue," the officer replied vaguely. The passengers were silent now, their eyes darting between Barron and the officers. Some looked outraged, others just stunned. But one voice broke through the quiet. "This is ridiculous." It was the older woman who had spoken to Barron earlier. She stood up, her face flushed with anger. "That boy hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. It's the pilot who's out of line." Her outburst seemed to embolden others. A man in a business suit chimed in, "Yeah, I've been sitting here the whole time. He's done nothing but mind his own business." The officers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't what they'd expected. One of them spoke into his radio, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the escalating situation. Barron remained composed, but inside, he was shaken. Not because of the confrontation, he was used to being a target, but because of the people standing up for him. Strangers who didn't owe him anything but refused to stay silent. And yet, the pilot hadn't shown his hand completely. Whatever was coming next wasn't just about Barron. It was about something far bigger, and the truth was about to come crashing down. As the confrontation unfolded, the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The security officers hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the passengers' vocal support for Barron. One of them turned away briefly to speak into his radio, and the other shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of eyes. Meanwhile, Barron remained standing, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The older woman who had defended him earlier wasn't done yet. She took a step closer, her voice firm. "I don't care who you think you are. This young man has been polite and quiet the entire time. If anyone should be escorted off this plane, it's that pilot." Her words landed like a thunderclap. The murmurs grew louder, and more passengers began to chime in, their voices rising in a wave of indignation. "She's right," one shouted. "We've all seen what's happening here." The pilot suddenly reappeared, his face flushed with anger. "Enough!" he barked, his voice cutting through the commotion. He pointed directly at Barron, his hand shaking with rage. "I don't care what these people say. This flight doesn't leave until he's off the plane." Barron turned to face him, his gaze steady and unflinching. "And why is that?" he asked, his voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is it because of something I've done? Or is it because of who you think I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The pilot faltered for a moment, but then his expression hardened. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You might have everyone else fooled, but I know trouble when I see it." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers shouted over each other, some calling for the pilot to be removed, others demanding answers. The security officers looked overwhelmed, unsure of how to regain control. Then, a man in the back of the cabin stood up. He was older, with a weathered face and the air of someone who had seen his fair share of battles. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, his voice deep and commanding. The noise subsided as heads turned toward him. "I recognize that young man," he continued, pointing to Barron. "And I think the rest of you do too. That's Barron Trump, son of the former president of the United States." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Barron felt a wave of unease wash over him as the revelation sank in. He wasn't ashamed of his identity, but he had wanted to avoid the spotlight, to simply exist without the weight of his last name. The pilot's face twisted into a sneer. "So what? That doesn't give him the right to act entitled." "Entitled?" The older man shot back. "The only one acting entitled here is you. I don't care who he is or isn't. Your behavior is unacceptable." The security officers seemed to sense the tide turning. One of them stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, we need to de-escalate this situation. If you continue to provoke the passengers, we may have to ask you to leave." The pilot's jaw dropped, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. This time it was Barron. "I think we've had enough drama for one flight," he said, his tone measured. "If you'd like me to leave, I will. But know this, every moment of this has been recorded, and I won't let your actions go unanswered." The pilot looked as if he had been slapped. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder again, and passengers began holding up their phones, some openly filming the confrontation. For a brief moment, It felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then, the unexpected happened. One of the security officers turned to Barron and said, "You don't have to go anywhere, sir. Please take your seat." The cabin erupted into cheers, but Barron didn't move. Something told him this wasn't over yet. The pilot's eyes burned with fury, and Barron could see that whatever was coming next would be his final, desperate move. The pilot's fury boiled over. His face flushed red as he slammed a fist against the cabin wall. "This is my plane," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of his rage. "I decide who stays and who goes." The crowd's cheers turned to gasps of disbelief. Passengers began whispering to one another, their disdain for the pilot spreading like wildfire. The older man from the back stood again, raising his hand to silence the murmurs. "Your plane," he said, his voice steady but biting. "Last I checked, this plane belongs to the airline, not to your ego. You're supposed to be a professional, but all I see is a man drunk on power, trying to humiliate someone who hasn't done a thing wrong." The words stung, and the pilot took a step back, momentarily lost for a response. But his silence didn't last long. "This isn't about power," he barked. "It's about rules, and I'm the one who enforces them." "Rules?" Barron interjected, his voice firm but calm. "What rule did I break? Tell everyone here what I've done to deserve being singled out like this." The pilot hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The truth was, he had no legitimate answer. His actions had been driven by personal bias, and now, cornered by the weight of public scrutiny, he was struggling to find a way out. One of the security officers stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, you need to calm down," he said, his tone professional but stern. "You're creating a disturbance, and it's our job to ensure the safety of everyone on board." The pilot's face twisted in disbelief. "You're taking his side?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "We're taking the side of what's right," the officer replied. "And right now, you're the one jeopardizing this flight." The passengers erupted in applause, their support for Barron growing stronger with every passing moment. The pilot, clearly outnumbered and outmatched, looked around desperately, searching for someone to back him up. But no one did. Even the flight attendants, who had been silent until now, exchanged nervous glances before one of them finally stepped forward. "Captain," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret, "I think it's best if you step aside. This situation has escalated far beyond what's acceptable." The pilot's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again. But then, something in his expression shifted. Perhaps it was the realization that he had lost control or the sheer weight of the passenger's judgment pressing down on him. Whatever it was, he finally backed down. "Fine," he spat, his words dripping with bitterness. "Let him stay. But this isn't over." With that, he stormed out of the cabin, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. Barron exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the ordeal began. He turned to the passengers, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said simply. The older woman who had defended him earlier reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said warmly. "And don't worry, we'll make sure the world knows what really happened here." Barron nodded, his gratitude evident in his eyes. But as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot's ominous parting words were more than just empty threats. Something told him this battle was far from over. And as the plane finally prepared for takeoff, Barron couldn't help but wonder, what would the pilot's next move be? And how would it impact not just him but everyone on board? The plane ascended smoothly into the skies, the tension in the cabin finally beginning to dissipate. Passengers exchanged relieved glances, some even offering Barron encouraging smiles. Yet, despite the calm exterior, an undercurrent of unease lingered. The pilot's parting words echoed in Barron's mind like a warning bell that refused to be silenced. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, their professionalism masking the storm that had unfolded just moments ago. Barron accepted a glass of water, his fingers brushing against the cup as he tried to ground himself in the present. Across the aisle, the elderly veteran who had first stood up for him raised his drink in a silent toast of solidarity. "Keep your head up," the man said softly, his voice carrying an air of wisdom earned through years of hardship. Bullies like him thrive on fear, but you showed courage today. Barron nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. Thank you, he replied. I just hope this ends here. But it didn't. 30 minutes into the flight, a muffled commotion from the cockpit sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged hurried whispers, their composed facades cracking ever so slightly. One of them disappeared behind the cockpit door, leaving the others to reassure passengers that everything was fine. It wasn't. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The pilot's voice was laced with barely restrained anger, making the already tense atmosphere even heavier. I want to apologize for the earlier disruption, he continued, his tone dripping with insincerity. But let me remind everyone that rules exist for a reason. Some people think they're above them, but they're not. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the thinly veiled jab at Barron sparking renewed whispers. Barron, however, remained composed, his gaze steady as he stared at the front of the plane. The intercom cut off abruptly, but the unease lingered. Minutes later, the plane jolted unexpectedly, sending a wave of gasps through the cabin. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face pale as she tried to calm everyone down. Just a little turbulence, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Barron wasn't convinced. His instincts told him something was off, very off. And then, he noticed it. The pilot's shadow through the frosted glass of the cockpit door, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The veteran leaned toward Barron, his voice a low whisper. That man's unhinged. He's not done yet. You need to be ready for anything. Barron's heart pounded as he nodded, adrenaline surging through him. He had faced public scrutiny before, endured harsh criticism and unfair treatment. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of reputation, this was a matter of safety. As the plane continued its steady course, the tension inside grew unbearable. And then, as if on cue, the cockpit door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. The pilot stood there, his eyes wild, his breathing heavy. All right, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. If no one else is going to do something, I will. Before anyone could react, the pilot stormed down the aisle, his gaze locked on Barron. Gasps and cries of alarm erupted from the passengers, but no one dared move. The tension reached its peak as the pilot loomed over Barron, his face twisted with rage. You think you're untouchable? The pilot sneered, his voice low and venomous. Think again. But before he could take another step, the elderly veteran shot to his feet, planting himself firmly between Barron and the pilot. His voice rang out, strong and unwavering. You've gone far enough. The cabin fell into stunned silence. All eyes were on the two men, one a symbol of authority gone rogue, the other a quiet hero standing up for what was right. What happened next would not only define the rest of the flight but also leave an indelible mark on everyone on board. The stakes were higher than ever, and Barron knew that this was no longer just about him. This was about standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. The tension in the cabin was electric as the veteran stood firm, his gaze locked with the pilot's. The passengers watched with bated breath, their fear and disbelief palpable. The pilot's rage simmered just beneath the surface, but the veteran's unyielding stance seemed to give everyone else a glimmer of hope. You've crossed the line, the veteran said, his voice calm but commanding. Sit down and do your job, or I'll make sure you never fly again. The pilot's lips curled into a sneer, but before he could retort, a young woman stood up, clutching her phone. I've recorded everything, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. If you don't stop, this goes online, and your career is over. Her words sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin as others held up their phones, some already live-streaming the chaos. The pilot's bravado faltered, his gaze darting to the phones pointed at him. You think you can threaten me? He barked, but his voice lacked the conviction it held earlier. That's enough, came a firm voice from behind. It was the lead flight attendant, flanked by two of her colleagues. Captain, return to the cockpit now, or we'll have no choice but to restrain you. The pilot hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching. It was clear he was weighing his options, But the growing support for Barron and the threat of public exposure left him with little room to maneuver. Realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, the pilot snarled in frustration before storming back toward the cockpit. "You'll regret this," he spat over his shoulder, slamming the door behind him. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, but the tension remained. The veteran turned to Barron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well, son," he said. "Don't let people like him get to you." Barron nodded, his gratitude evident. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil. As the flight continued, the passengers rallied around Barron, offering words of support and encouragement. The young woman who had recorded the incident uploaded the footage, and within minutes, it went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and hashtags like #StandWithBarron and #JusticeInTheSkies began trending worldwide. By the time the plane landed, a crowd of reporters and supporters had gathered at the terminal. As Barron stepped off the plane, he was met with cheers and applause. The veteran walked beside him, a quiet pillar of strength. One reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Barron, what do you have to say about what happened on the flight?" Barron paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "It's about standing up to injustice no matter where it happens. No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human. We're all in this together." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Barron and the veteran walked away, the world watched, inspired by their courage and resilience. Later that evening, Barron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through countless messages of support. He knew the fight against prejudice and injustice wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. And as he closed his eyes, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the most unexpected battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And in those moments, standing up, even when it's hard, can change the world.